is that those environmental provisions, they do matter. They make a difference. They can actually enhance environmental protection. I have to say, however, that the literature on this question provides mixed evidence. So there's basically two types of studies. Some are qualitative, some are quantitative. If you look at qualitative studies, there's different conclusions. So for example, qualitative case studies on US-Peru trade agreement. One study found that it had a positive effect for endangered species, but then you have another study suggesting that it had a negative effect for forests, especially in Peru. For statistical, so quantitative analysis, they provide findings that are a little bit more consistent with each other. Basically, they find that a trade agreement with environmental provision is associated with a reduction in emission of a number of different pollutants. However, it's difficult to know why a trade agreement, for example, with environmental provision would lead to a reduction in CO2 emission, especially since there's very often little, if not nothing, on CO2 emission or climate change in a trade agreement. So what's the causal mechanism here linking a trade agreement with environmental provision with this reduction in CO2 emission relative to concluding a trade agreement without an environmental provision? Is it because there's some form of technology diffusion, capacity that are being built? Is it because the trade agreement helped to build a stronger civil society on environmental matters? It's basically hard to find out what is the causal chain. So to help a little bit to better understand what's the causal process here, with a number of colleagues, we made use of a data set of all the environmental regulation adopted, domestic regulation adopted globally. And we looked for a correlation. Basically, are countries more likely to adopt environmental regulation domestically when they conclude a trade agreement with environmental provision? And we find that the answer is yes, for low-income country and middle-income country. This is, why this little box here is in green. And it's especially before the entry into force of the trade agreement. So basically in the time period between the signature of a trade agreement and its entry into force, developing countries, broadly defined, including low-income and middle-income countries, are more likely to adopt environmental provision. More likely to adopt environmental regulations. However, it's not the case for high-income countries. We find actually the opposite. So statistically speaking, it is significant. So it's not a non-finding, it is a finding, but high-income countries are less likely to adopt domestic regulation in the time period between the conclusion and the entry into force of the trade agreement. So to dig a little bit deeper, we looked at specific issue areas. So we know that more and more trade agreements would have specific provision addressing, for example, biodiversity or water or air pollution or fisheries. And we also know for the domestic regulation, which specific environmental issue that they are addressing. And so we were able to find, once again, a positive correlation. So the more a trade agreement will specifically address things like water, air pollution, soil, pesticides, the more, especially developing countries, are likely to adopt domestic regulation on those same issue areas. But it's not the case for ozone, and it's not for climate, the relation is pretty weak. So it seems that it matters more for regional issue like water and soil and air pollution than for global issues like climate or the ozone layer. The third takeaway from this presentation is that environmental provision are not always trade restrictive. When I talk to people, when I talk to experts on environmental policymaking, they want to know if a trade agreement with environmental provision is more or less likely to have an impact on the environment. But trade experts, they're not really curious to know if those same provisions have an effect on trade flows. They're not curious because they assume that most of them, they assume that those provisions are actually trade restrictive. And that's because when they hear environmental provision, they think about exceptions and exclusions and other potential trade barriers that can be adopted perhaps sometimes for environmental motivations, but also perhaps sometimes for protectionist motivation, because a country wants to protect its own industry. But I think this representation that a lot of trade experts share is actually not accurate. So again, we did some statistics here, and we find that, well, what you can find on the first row, that trade agreements are associated with an increase in trade volume. This is not surprising. It makes sense. The more two countries, I mean, if two countries share a trade agreement, they are likely to see an increase in their trade volume. This is what we would expect. But it's the second line that I think is especially interesting, is also when these trade agreements include environmental provision, we see a positive effect on trade volume. And here we distinguish two different types, broad categories of environmental provision. What we call liberal provision. So those are the provisions that favor transparency, promotion of trade in environmental goods, for example, and a second category that we call defensive. So those are the exceptions. They are basically there to protect the regulatory space of the parties to a trade agreement. And we find that liberal environmental provision tend to increase trade volume, but defensive provision are more likely to have a negative effect on trade volume. But this negative effect is relatively small. And most environmental provisions are actually not defensive. They tend to be more liberal. So again, we dig a little bit deeper and we distinguish between two different types of goods. So brown goods like steel and cement, and green, what we call green goods. So environmental goods, for example, equipment for wind power. And we find that defensive provision reduce trade in brown goods, but liberal provision increase trade in green goods. So this is exactly what we want to see from a trade agreement with environmental provision. And the last takeaway from this presentation is that USMCA is not as groundbreaking as NAFTA was. To be sure, if you compare USMCA with NAFTA and its side agreement, their respective side agreements, the more recent one would include more provision simply by counting the number of provisions. The main difference, I think, is that Chapter 24 of USMCA includes a lot of provisions that are addressing specific environmental issue areas like ozone layer, ship pollution, air quality, biodiversity, invasive species, forests, and several pages actually on fisheries. But comparing NAFTA to USMCA is a bit unfair because NAFTA was concluded almost 30 years ago. So if you compare USMCA with a more recent agreement like the CPTPP that Mexico and Canada are part of, then, I mean, they're very similar. There are interesting differences, but they are quite similar, at least if you measure them by the number of environmental provision that they have. So for this reason, I think USMCA is unlikely to have the same systemic effect on the entire trade system that NAFTA had 25 years ago. To be fair, there are some interesting novelties in USMCA regarding things like marine litter, wildlife trafficking, food waste, but they are not particularly ambitious, most of them. This is simply a list of references of some of the publication. key results, if you want to know more from the key results that I presented here. And I thank you very much. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Jean-Frédéric. That was really terrific. And I'm sure that many who listen to the presentation will